So it's been a pleasure to listen in to the conversation this morning. What I'd like to do is just throw away my prepared remarks and improvise in a way that tries to pick up on some of the threads that we've heard so far. I want to be sure to pick up something that Beverly Tatum, who's an old friend, said about indoctrination. And then I want to try and remember to link to a remark that Susan made, who's at Williams College. I don't know if she's in the room, but and I don't know her last name, so because she's a new friend. But she said something about the importance of social justice that I want to respond to. One of the surprises for me has been realizing that this morning, and it's so obvious, I don't know why it was a surprise, but realizing that there's a role for William Penn in this discussion. So I'll bring him in too. Now let me start with just a tiny bit of background about me and why I spent time learning about William Penn. Most of my work has been focused on this, what I think is really a very simple and very obvious observation, which is that the production of a new idea is really the most important economic activity that humans undertake. When someone produces, by doing some research, testing some possibilities, produces something like the formula for oral rehydration therapy, which is just a set of instructions that you can give to a parent to use to rehydrate a child who's severely dehydrated, typically because of a cholera or some disease. When you produce that idea, use a little bit of salt, some minerals, maybe a bit of a banana if you need to, but add some sugar too. It turns out sugar helps. And put that in the water that you give to the child. Don't just feed them plain water, because that will kill them. But the right formula for how to rehydrate a child has saved millions, I think tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of lives. And the value you can create with that one idea boggles the mind. And it's different from the value you could create if you produced a bottle of Pedialyte, which is the store-bought version of these fluids. One bottle of Pedialyte could save the life of one child, but the formula can save the lives of hundreds of millions. These ideas have values that scale with the global population if we allow ideas to flow around the world. So most of my work has been focused on exploring the implications of that, I think, simple insight. One dimension of that is that science is the greatest thing humans have ever invented. It is a somewhat odd social system, and we don't pay that much attention to it. We don't recognize that it's odd. We just take it for granted. There's a very good book called The Knowledge Machine by a colleague former colleague at NYU, which he's a student of the philosophy of science. I think of him as a historian or sociologist of science, but who asked the obvious question, which is, why did it take people so long to invent science? Given its enormous value, why was it only in the last couple centuries that we invented it? And it's because it's hard to make science work. It's hard to get flawed humans to work together to actually converge towards the truth. But fortunately, people developed science, and it has changed our world, changed our lives. It's been extraordinarily important. And I honestly fear that we may be at a time where we could lose science. This sounds crazy, but look, think about Babylonian math. It's like, oh yeah, no, they had their thing. They were active for a while, but it all fell apart, and we still use 60 seconds in a minute, but beyond that, it went away. I don't think this is an inconceivable outcome. Then science as we know it gets lost. And I think nothing could be worse for humanity than were that to happen. So my remarks about Eisenhower and the meteorologists, and we're focused on what's going on and why is science threatened. What can we do to protect it? Now I'll come back to those things. But there was another part of my career where I started thinking about economic development. And my conclusion was that it would be useful to think about new jurisdictions in the developing world that people could move to, because new jurisdictions make it possible for people to change the social environment, the social circumstances, the norms that they live and worked under. I was very impressed by Penn's innovation in establishing Pennsylvania, and I named the concept that I was advocating for a charter city because of Penn's use of the charter for Pennsylvania, which was the first, as I understand it, the first constitution that had a potential for amendment to it. But in that constitution, he exempted from amendment the provision ensuring the separation of church and state. Now, from my limited reading of history, I think Pennsylvania was the reason the separation of church and state became an accepted principle in the United States. There were other developments that were given credit, but Penn was the one who really committed to this principle and recruited into Pennsylvania people of many different faiths on the basis of his commitment that there would be a strict separation of church and state. Now, how does church and state bear on the future of science? I want to propose something analogous, which is that we also adopt a separation of social justice and scholarship. That doesn't mean I don't believe in social justice any more than it means that the people who wanted a separation of church and state didn't believe in religion. But they believed there was something very important about the separation of those concerns. And I think historically that has proven to be true. So what I want to argue is that we've let these two things be conflated. And I don't think I fundamentally disagree with Susan, but her question about the importance of social justice could be interpreted as a statement that we need to blend social justice into all of our scholarship, all of our teaching, all of our activities. And I think that would actually be a profound mistake. And I think we've done it, and I think we're now suffering some of the costs of that. Beverly's remark suggests why we don't need that kind of mixing. We don't need professors to try and indoctrinate students about whatever social justice concern seems important to the professors. As she described in the story of Derek Black, Black benefited from being part of a community of people who had different ways of seeing the world, and he learned from interacting with them. But the classroom and the lectures by the professor, I think, did, as she suggested, did not involve and did not need to involve indoctrination. And to the extent that any professor might have tried to engage in indoctrination, I think the odds are very likely that it would be counterproductive. It wouldn't work. I talked to Susan briefly, and one of her follow-up comments was that we should think about social justice and understand it better, and that's actually something I strongly believe in. We should devote more scholarly and research attention to the question of how norms about right and wrong evolve over time. I think it's an incredibly important issue But if you don't understand that process, you're very much at risk of doing things that will be counterproductive, that will undermine what your intent was. And I think we see this in this domain of social justice. Now, let me go back to what I had intended to say in my talk here, although I'll adjust it slightly. Imagine that I had been one of the meteorologists that General Eisenhower was consulting with in the lead up to D-Day. And imagine that I, as is true, I believe in what I would call moral activism. I think it's important for all of us to try to guide our moral beliefs as a society in a direction that I think unambiguously represents progress. A good historical example of this would be the kind of moral activism that led to the abolition of slavery. I don't think it's controversial at all today to say that slavery was wrong, but that many people in a different era believed that slavery was morally acceptable. Through some process, our beliefs about right and wrong changed, and that's no longer accepted as morally acceptable. So imagine that I, as a meteorologist, believed in moralistic activism. I'm trying to avoid social justice because I think sometimes these terms are provocative unintentionally. So I had tried out moral activism when I was preparing my remarks. But now, suppose, and this is hypothetical, but suppose I were convinced that the biggest moral issue right now is the degree to which humans inflict pain and suffering on non-human animals. I think it's quite possible that in 100 or 200 years, people will look back and see what we do with factory farming and with creatures like pigs who are relatively sentient and aware, the really horrible things we do to these animals. I think in a couple centuries, they'll look back at us and say, we were like people who believed in slavery. Now, animal rights, animal welfare is not my personal motivating issue, but let's imagine it were, just for purposes of discussion. Let's imagine that. Because I think it's easier to see some of the issues here if we take something that's a little bit less current and a little bit less emotive. I doubt that most people in the room, I doubt anybody in the room actually gets up each day thinking that protecting animals is the most important thing to try and do today. So now imagine, let's go back to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was tasked with the invasion, what became the Normandy invasion. That could succeed only on certain days of the month that had particular configuration of tides and a full moon, but the weather was also very important. We know from some small talk that John Kennedy engaged in with Dwight Eisenhower, that Eisenhower thought the meteorologists were very important in this. Kennedy asked him, what was the biggest advantage you had in the D-Day invasion? And he said it was our meteorologists. So what did the meteorologists do? They had to make a decision as D-Day was approaching about whether or not to launch the invasion in circumstances where the weather looked very, very foreboding. Perhaps weather was so bad that it was going to make the invasion impossible. Eisenhower had anticipated the importance of weather. He had put together 3 teams, he and the other people in this process. There were 3 independent teams of 2 meteorologists that were then supervised by a particular individual whose name I'm now forgetting, but who had some experience in meteorology, but was really more fundamentally a geophysicist. He wasn't really a meteorologist, but he had good experience in management, and so he was tasked with supervising these 3 independent teams. One was from the Metropolitan Weather Service, one was from the British Navy, one was from the US Air Force. We know from the reports later that these teams fought with each other over everything. They didn't agree with anything anybody else said. The only thing one of them said, the only thing they all agreed in was that this man that they all reported to was a glory hound and couldn't be trusted, didn't have any good experience with the weather. So they behaved pretty much like the academics that we all know and love. Eisenhower, of course, didn't want to get drawn into those very detailed, acrimonious discussions, but got the summaries from Stagg. It was this man named Stagg who provided him the information. And as it turned out, the weather was so bad a day or two before the planned start of D-Day that they decided to postpone for one day. Then the team reached a consensus that there was an opening, potentially. The weather would be better on the following day. And so there were things that had to be set in motion days in advance, but they made the decision to go ahead after a one-day postponement to launch on the 6th. As many of you know, the weather was bad that day. The skies were more overcast, so the planes that were supposed to drop troops in gliders in particular places many times had them end up in the wrong places. The bombing campaign wasn't as effective as it could be. The troops, when they landed, were all seasick. So I had always thought that the story was that the invasion succeeded despite the fact that they launched on a day when the weather was bad. But this is where you have to remember that story about the two people who were running away from the bear, and one says to the other, you can't outrun the bear, and it's, no, I just have to outrun you. What mattered was that the U.S. had an advantage relative to the Germans. The Germans saw the weather being so bad, they thought there was no chance that Eisenhower would launch the invasion. So they were basically took the week off. Many German generals went off for exercises in Brittany. Rommel went back to see his wife. So the Germans were very unprepared, so that the imbalance between the meteorologists who said we can do it even though the conditions are bad, and the Germans who said, oh, they'll never do it, was a significant advantage for the Allies. Okay, now this is where we want to be. We want our leaders to say, our intellectuals, our researchers did this incredibly valuable thing for us, and it's good that we have them. That is not where we are right now, and I don't need to remind any of you of that, but we have to ask why. So imagine I had been a meteorologist and had been in one of those sessions with General Eisenhower. And imagine at some point in the conversation they were talking about food that they had to supply for both the troops and any animals. I don't know if they still use horses or use dogs, but imagine in this conversation there's some discussion about the food that you've got a provision for the animals. And imagine I chimed in and said, General Eisenhower, you can't say animals anymore. You have to say non-human animals because it's discriminatory to speak of animals as if they are different from us. Now, Dwight Eisenhower seems to have been a person of, great reserve and strength, and I can imagine him gritting his teeth and nodding and then moving the conversation forward. But think about how angry it would have made him for me to intervene in that way. And ask, would he have really said to Kennedy afterwards, well, our meteorologists, they were our greatest strength. If I had taken this inappropriate opportunity to go beyond my mandate, beyond my function, and try to lecture him about animal rights. I think this is what we have done as researchers too often, and I think it is biting us very badly right now. The place where I think the damage is most obvious is in the advice that people from public health gave during the COVID epidemic. And we're now seeing a very serious backlash, I think, against public health, but expertise more generally, academics more generally, and a kind of pattern that opponents would call political correctness or excessive concerns about social justice. But these kind of interventions, like the one I described had I been a meteorologist, I think contaminated the communication from the public officials to the public. I think it also contaminated their own discussions to an extent where they made very bad recommendations. We're now seeing this I think the most interesting and probably relevant case was the decision to close schools and to keep them closed for as much as a year, when we knew at the time, everybody looking at this at the time, whoever considered a cost-benefit analysis could see that it was totally wasteful to close the schools. But yet, there was a kind of a moralistic dimension to the advice from the public health community, which is you just have to do everything. And if you can't close the bars, well, then you have to close the schools. That decision, there's a new book coming out about this it's an MIT Press book this month that will come out called An Abundance of Caution, which retraces that episode. And it persuaded me, I don't think the author is too explicit about this, but it persuaded me that this episode, for so many families who bore the brunt of a terrible public policy decision and who could see that it was wrong, it was doing enormous harm to their children and offering almost no benefit in terms of reducing the spread of the virus. I think this turned many of them against science, against experts, and in favor of a political regime that would attack the scientists, attack the experts, undermine them. So the excessive attention, I think, to something like social justice can actually lead to, I think, very bad policy and can especially undermine the kind of dispassionate attitude that we need to bring to bear to these public policy questions. That there are always trade-offs, there are costs and benefits, and it's a subtle process to weigh those to decide what to do. If you bring in a moralistic dimension and refuse to listen to the evidence from the other side and condescend to anyone who tries to suggest there may be another side to this, you will undermine the effectiveness of science as a system for making decisions, and you'll feed the kind of backlash that we're now living with against science and expertise. So let me just conclude by saying that I believe in moralistic activism. I think some of the greatest improvements in some of the most important dimensions of real progress have come not from the internal combustion or the transistor, but it's from changes where people decide it's wrong for us to enslave someone. So those dimensions of progress, and if you're curious, there's scholarship on this. There's a book called The Civilizing Process by Norbert Elias. There's scholarship we could look at this, but it deserves more attention. I believe that this is an important activity, but just as religion at the time of Penn was important, it's a different activity from research. It's a different activity from scholarship. We should draw those lines, keep them separate, and if we do that going forward, maybe we can keep science alive. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions, and that should have raised some questions. So, microphone here.
Bill Kale in Boston. I guess I'm still struggling. You had me until the COVID response because I guess I'm not smart enough to see the moral activism component. I
Yeah.
accept that decisions might have been, in hindsight, and maybe you're suggesting even didn't need hindsight, might have been made differently. But remembering that the healthcare system in the United States was on its knees and verge of collapse in some areas, and that the thought, I think at the time, was if the healthcare system collapses, there'll be all sorts of collateral suffering.
Yep.
And so, of course, the mantra was flatten the curve. And so I had interpreted the school decisions, for example, as one attempt to flatten the curve to the extent that these kids then go home and expose others. So can you help me with the moral activism component?
Yeah, let me just say that I think you're right that I haven't closed that case. I haven't really made a convincing case there. I think I can, but I think it would take more time. But on those specifics, there are some people who are now claiming, there's another book I haven't read as carefully by two political scientists who, according to the reviews, suggest that none of what were called the non-pharmaceutical interventions were ever beneficial. I don't think that is true. I think that some of these interventions, like the lockdowns, were important, especially during these peak phases where flattening the curve was an issue and protecting just the capacity of the hospital system was important. So I'm not saying, and I don't agree with anybody who says none of those things made a difference. But I am saying that, as many people observe, we imposed lockdown in many places where there was very little in the way of active infection and no imminent danger to the hospital system. So we applied it much more broadly with this kind of moralistic reasoning, not saying, well, let's do the cost-benefit analysis. It might be useful here, it might not be useful there. And by the time we got to the shutdown on schools, we were no longer facing the possibility that our hospital systems would be overwhelmed, and it didn't help at all. Children were not vectors for spreading this disease. They didn't get hospitalized. They weren't active in spreading it, and it was like a symbolic act that offered no real benefit. So read the book Abundance of Caution for more details on this. Actually, while we're waiting, let me explain the sense in which I don't think I've yet kind of closed the loop. I think there's still something that has to be addressed, which is my conjecture that a kind of arrogance and a moralistic arrogance was part of what led to the bad decisions about schools. But I haven't established that yet for you. Yeah.
I wanted to return to the weather, not all the way back to D-Day, but to late 20th, early 21st century debates about global warming, now called climate change. Because it follows a very similar dynamic. But the chronology, it's preceding the examples that you gave, but similar disbelief in what scientific experts were saying. Also, originally, a lot of the alarm about climate change was raised about things that seemed abstract or not affecting human animals. And the concern about humans was put in slightly later to emphasize them rather than the polar bears. So it doesn't match the analysis you've just given, and I would welcome your comments about maybe there's a bigger phenomenon.
If you don't mind, I'm not sure I understood the sense in which you think it doesn't match. The mic is right. The mic's right there. Yeah.
It's older than the examples you gave, indicating a longer chronology of the problem, going back decades earlier, and the sense in which there would be a moral case about humans and their behavior seems to have been added in later. The original problem didn't have anything to do with that.
Okay. So I may have erred in trying to improvise here, but let me be clear. I'm not trying to make a case about the importance of humans versus non-human animals. I was trying to intervene about like climate change versus global warming, this is another place where you get scolded with this moralistic tone for using the wrong words right now. But I'm not trying to say that's the forefront issue or the issue we should concern ourselves with. I was trying to use it as an example of a type of moralistic activism that might capture some people. And I was trying to get you to think about the possibility that you might agree it would be wrong for somebody to inject that kind of moralistic activism in the middle of a debate about should we launch D-Day. Now, climate change or global warming raises a whole slew of issues that one has to think about in the context of what I'm saying. Let me give you one. If we believe in the idea of democracy as scientists, and if the voters vote to adopt policies that we don't believe in, that we think are harmful, how do we respond to that? I think that there's a tendency to want to get on a high horse and scold and hector and be moralistic that is counterproductive. And there may be a certain extent to which we have to say, if we're really going to support democracy, we have to accept the fact that we're going down a path which is not the one that we would have selected. And we still have to give honest, objective assessments of what that will mean. So we can tell people, this is what we think will happen to sea levels. This is what we think will happen to farming and agriculture. But I think we also have to be honest. I don't think anybody seriously believes that that will mean the end of human existence on the planet. We sometimes catastrophize as if climate change will mean no humans will survive. I think the evidence suggests that humans are very good at adaptation and will survive. It may be a less pleasant existence than we've had. It may be a profound mistake. I think it will be. But we have to decide, are we going to sacrifice support for science by offending people who make a decision that's different than the one that we would have made? Or do we still want to preserve science even if voters decide they're okay with climate change?